Harden to the corner. Westbrook connects on a three.
Then you get a downhill floater for Exum.
Harden meets Dončić. His three's good. James Harden on the step back.
Welcome to Inside the Mavs, presented by Aura. My name is Kevin Gray, Mavericks pre- and post-game host on 97.1 The Freak on the Dallas Mavericks Radio Network. Appreciate you joining me here for the latest episode of Inside the Mavs. Make sure you download and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast for free. Give it a 5-star rating and write a review for it while you're there. And if you're watching this on my YouTube channel at Kevin Gray Sports, make sure you like and comment on the video and subscribe to Kevin Gray Sports on YouTube. And you can follow me on Twitter at the same for Kevin Gray Sports. Can the Mavericks bounce back in game number 2 against the Los Angeles Clippers to even up their series at 1 game apiece, with game 2 on Tuesday night as the Mavericks try to get themselves a split in LA before they return to Dallas for games 3 and 4 beginning on Friday night? Kawhi Leonard officially listed as questionable going into game number 2. He had the same designation going into game number 1, and of course, he did not play. A player who has not played since the end of March, dealing with that right knee inflammation in that surgically repaired right knee that's seen a torn ACL and a torn meniscus be operated on, and a player who has not had any contact in practice for quite some time. The Clippers practiced on Monday, but they went through non-contact, which means Kawhi Leonard didn't see any contact himself. So the prognosis looking much like the same as it was at game number 1. Kawhi Leonard doesn't appear that he will be available for game number 2, which makes a lot of sense based on the idea that he would be trying to come back without real practice time and without any contact in practice as well, and then insert himself into a playoff situation. So for the Mavericks, it appears they'll be playing game 2 fully healthy themselves, as the Mavericks will have all 15 players available for them in game 2, with Kawhi Leonard most likely being out again for the second consecutive game in this series. And for the Mavericks, a disappointing start to this series, knowing that they couldn't take advantage of a Clippers team without Kawhi Leonard, but at the same time, the Clippers were able to get terrific help from guys like James Harden and Ivica Zubac, who had a career playoff high of 20 points, also with 15 rebounds as well. James Harden scoring 20 of his 28 points in the first half. I'll get to a little bit later in our show some things that the Mavericks will have to do from an adjustment standpoint, particularly Luka Doncic, when it comes to the defense, because as you watched game 1, as I rewatched it back, you saw the defensive breakdowns, particularly on the individual defensive efforts of Luka Doncic and others, where the Clippers did a great job of hunting Luka in those matchups to get him on an island defensively with James Harden, and Harden exploited it time and time again, whether it was for himself or finding others to be able to knock down shots and get easy buckets at the rim. So there are several things that the Mavericks will have to do to improve going into game number 2, but this is more about the others for the Mavericks. Well, you say, Kevin, if you look at the second half numbers for this team, after, of course, they only scored 30 points in the first half, the Mavericks were able to go 22 of 39 from the field at a 56% clip. They shot 53% from downtown in the second half as well, going 8 of 15. In fact, Kyrie Irving scored 20 points in that third quarter alone, and you saw offensively the Mavericks look much more like themselves in the second half, but they had dug themselves too deep of a hole to be able to climb out of it after they were down by 26 at the end of the first half and down by 23 at the end of the third quarter. In fact, Ty Lue, talking to the media on Monday, said, look, we basically shut down our schemes defensively in the second half, just ensuring that the Mavericks weren't able to take and make a bunch of threes, and we were able to protect that so that they didn't have to show necessarily defensively what they were going to be doing for the rest of the game, and it worked out just fine. But the Mavericks were able to take advantage of some of that offensively and hopefully building on the momentum that they saw in the second half to carry over into game number 2, because several things that the Mavericks will have to improve on in game 2 starts with their physicality and their mental toughness in the first beginning of the game, the way that the Clippers were able to dominate, especially on the inside. And Daniel Gafford talked about it post-game himself. The Clippers punched the Dallas Mavericks in the mouth. Ivica Zubac was able to get on the inside, get some easy buckets, really establishing position on Daniel Gafford, and really took advantage and punished him down low to really set the tone offensively for the Clippers, not only from a physicality standpoint, but getting some easy buckets in the paint to really open up some things on the outside for the Clippers. So that's number one. The Mavericks physically have to be much more in tune at the outset of game number two to ensure that they are staying in it throughout the course of the game, because they can't get punched in the mouth and think that a team as good as the Clippers are not going to continue to punch going forward, knowing that their backs are against the wall proverbially without Kawhi Leonard. Well, you say, Kevin, the Clippers have been playing at times decently without Kawhi Leonard, and you saw that in game number one. And they played like a team much more prepared to be without their superstar than the team that should have been prepared with the two superstars that they had in Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving. That's simply inexcusable going into game number two. More on what the Mavericks will have to do from an adjustment standpoint to get themselves tied at 1-1 in this series. And we'll take a look at some of the things that the Mavericks did in game one that simply cannot happen in game number two. But before we get there, let's take a quick break here on Inside the Mavs. I hear from today's sponsor of our video and our podcast. Let's hear from Aura. Today's video is brought to you by Aura. Do a Google search on your name and email address to see how much information comes up about you. I was devastated by the amount of information that I could be seeing searching my name and profile, and I knew then I needed to be protected for not just myself, but also for my family. Data brokers sell your information to scammers, spammers, and anyone else who may want to target you. Your full name, email, home address, health records, your relatives, it's all out there. That's why I've been using Aura, the sponsor of today's video. Aura shows me which data brokers are selling my information and automatically submits opt-out requests for me. Cleaning up my information not only helps reduce the amount of spam I get, but it protects me from hackers who could use this information to help them access my social media accounts, bank accounts, and other sensitive information. Aura also does so much more to protect me and my family from online threats that I can't see. It's really easy to set up, so I don't have to download several different apps to get things like antivirus, VPN, password management, parental controls, identity theft insurance, and more. I get everything at one affordable price. You may already have one of these tools already, but not having Aura is like locking the front door and leaving the back door wide open. Aura is always on, doing the hard work to protect me and my family so I can focus on other tasks with peace of mind. I value my privacy and I value yours. You can go to aura.com/Kevin Gray to start your 2-week free trial. Please see the link in the description. Back here on Inside the Mavs. Again, thank you for hanging out with us through that quick break, and thank you to today's sponsor of our video and our podcast in Aura. The Mavericks looking to climb back in this series to even it up at 1 game apiece after falling by 12 in game number 1 to the Los Angeles Clippers in the first round of their Western Conference playoff matchup, with game 2 on Tuesday before they continue the series on Friday at the American Airlines Center. The Mavericks are fully healthy and will be good to go from their side of things. We detailed a little bit earlier that Kawhi Leonard officially listed as questionable again for game number 2. What was questionable a lot in game number 1 was the defense that was played by the Dallas Mavericks, where you say, Kevin, you look at the second quarter, the Mavericks only gave up 22 points to the Los Angeles Clippers after giving up 34 in the first quarter. The problem was they only scored 8 points, did the Mavericks, in their worst performance in a quarter in franchise history. As you look at one of the things that they were unable to do was make buckets throughout the course of that first half with only 30 points. That simply can't be the case. And I detailed it in my recap that for the Mavericks, it was quite a bit of an anomaly. You don't expect Luka and Kyrie to go to combined 5 of 19 from the field in the first half. You don't expect all of these other guys to be as horrible as they were from the field, where outside of Luka Doncic, Kyrie Irving, and PJ Washington, you're talking about a group that went somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 of 26 from the field. It's just simply not going to get it done. And the others are one of the other keys as we look at the adjustments that the Mavericks are going to have to make into game number 2 is the others have got to show up, whether it's guys like Derrick Jones Jr., obviously Dante Exum, Tim Hardaway Jr., to the degree that at which he will play in game number 2, should see a little bit more of Josh Green, who seemed to be a lot more effective, especially in the second half as well. how Jason Kidd approaches game number 2, where the Mavericks had to go a lot smaller, given the fact that Daniel Gafford got into foul trouble. They were down big as well, so they're trying to find offense. And unfortunately, Maxi Kleber and Tim Hardaway were just simply not good enough in game number 1. These individuals and more have got to show up in support of Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving. When you've got two guys that combine for 64 of the 97 points, the amount of offensive load on the two of them is already great enough that if you're not going to get help from the other guys, it's going to make it difficult to win games in the postseason. So that's key number 1. Simply, you've got to get more help from the others. And we talked about that coming into the series. The likes of P.J. Washington, Derrick Jones Jr., Dante Exum, Tim Hardaway Jr., Maxi Kleber to a degree, and others are going to have to command the respect of the Clippers defense by knocking down shots, and they did not do that at all in game number 1. You saw it. I saw it. It was a pathetic effort in terms of knocking down shots for the Mavericks in game number 1. That simply cannot happen in the second game if they want to even this series at 1 game apiece. Also, for me, when you look at the defense that was played by the Dallas Mavericks and the way that they were not able to keep particularly James Harden in front of them, where he had 20 of his 28 points in the first half, it was really difficult sledding when you saw what the Mavericks were trying to do defensively against James Harden. Let's take a look at what the Mavericks were trying to do in terms of dealing with James Harden and what they were doing. Luka Doncic getting blown by, as you can see, based off of what we're looking at here. Yes, Steve Ballmer excited himself, but as you're seeing Luka Doncic not being able to provide that kind of defensive force, allowing James Harden to get to his left hand and find Zubac for a bucket. Here, Luka Doncic getting broken down once again. James Harden able to go left, finding Russell Westbrook in the corner for a three-pointer. Just another bad defensive effort. And then here, finding Luka Doncic, hunting him on switches, James Harden punishing him from the three-point line. And you saw plenty of that in that game as well. Again, another example, another screen, finding Luka Doncic and James Harden able to hit another three-pointer, as you saw throughout the course of the game. And simply, it was too much based off of what the Mavericks were trying to do to guard James Harden. That cannot happen. One of the things that I did like when I was watching the game back was the fact that P.J. Washington did a pretty good job on James Harden throughout the course of the game. Now, when you saw, obviously, when switches were happening, you saw the switch happen. Luka Doncic get put onto James Harden. They were looking for that, and they punished him over and over and over again. And even on the offensive side of things, what the Clippers did were able to get the ball out of Kyrie Irving's hands to try and force the others to beat them. And that was the formula that the Clippers used in game 1 to beat the Mavericks. Luka and Kyrie, you're not going to stop them necessarily offensively, but you can make the others try and beat you, and you tip your cap to those shooters if they're able to knock down shots, which is something that we have seen, throughout the course of this season, which is the idea that Dante Exum, Tim Hardaway Jr. at times, particularly P.J. Washington, Derrick Jones Jr., can knock down outside shots to be able to put pressure on other teams defensively with their shot making on the offensive end. That didn't happen in game number 1, but Luka Doncic defensively has to be much better because the Clippers will continue to hunt for Doncic and for Kyrie Irving to get them out on the switches and to punish them. But more importantly, the Mavericks have got to be much more physical in dealing with James Harden. You saw too many times in game number 1 his ability to get to his spot when he wanted to, however he wanted to, and he was able to make the Mavericks be punished on the defensive end. They've got to find a way to get up into James Harden's grill a little bit and make it more difficult for him. There was an example in the game where you saw Derek Lively get switched out onto James Harden. Derek Lively, who moved his feet well, would not allow James Harden to get to his left hand, eventually forcing him to go right and forcing, a tough shot. So, for the Mavericks, it's going to be about being more physical, being much more disciplined on the defensive end, and more important for Luka Doncic, as we've talked about previously when it comes to Jason Kidd and how he's talked about Luka in his defense, got to participate on that end much more. And Luka Doncic, from an offensive standpoint, said, look, I got to be much more aggressive. Got to be the aggressor going into game number 2. You got to show that on the defensive end as well. Luka Doncic, who was a top 10 steals guy, has been better in isolation defense, but when he was put on an island on the perimeter, the Clippers simply exploited him and did so way too much, and there wasn't enough help on the back end to be able to deal with James Harden. And that's one thing that the Mavericks will also have to ensure when it comes to Daniel Gafford. Gafford has got to stay on the floor for this team. You saw that he picked up 2 early fouls within the first 4 minutes of the game in the first quarter. Zubac getting him into early foul trouble, and they were able to physically set the tone in terms of scoring in the paint from there. Gafford has got to be available and on the floor, especially knowing that Dereck Lively, yes, who's been really good this year as a rookie, has got a lot that he's dealing with emotionally as he's dealing with the passing of his mother, trying to ensure that he's remaining focused on what he's got going on. And number 2, he's a 20-year-old rookie playing in his first postseason. And you saw he was able to respond well in the second half, and I thought really provided the Mavericks a defensive lift in the second half and really played well for them. But still, him and Gafford are going to have to be much better in tandem, particularly Daniel Gafford in tandem, to provide them the scoring, the rebounding, and the defense that we have seen from the two of them put together when they're playing 42 to 43 minutes. You've seen them score over 20 points, well over 10 rebounds, over 3 block shots per game combined between the two of them. That's when the Mavericks are able to utilize their vertical game in terms of pick and roll. But you saw the Clippers do a lot of taking away of that, but it was predicated on the fact that Daniel Gafford was not able to remain on the floor. So for the Mavericks defensively, they've got to be much more physical in dealing with James Harden, because I thought that the Mavericks did a pretty good job of dealing with Paul George. You look at the overall numbers from Paul George in game number 1. As you look at it, George himself, just 8 of 20 from the field. He did have the 22 points, but he went 4 of 12 from the three-point line. And I thought from the Mavericks, particularly in the first half, they did a good job of making things tough on him, because as good as the Clippers are, they shoot the ball extremely well. They were the number 4 team in the NBA this season in terms of offensive rating. They will get to their spots, and they've got guys that can put the ball in the basket, whether it's Harden, whether it's George, to obviously a lesser degree with Norman Powell coming off the bench. And the X factor that I thought really turned the tide for the Clippers, the energy and the motor of Russell Westbrook. Now, I don't expect Russell Westbrook, as you saw in this game, go 50% from 3. Yes, it was only 4 threes that he took, but he made a couple of big ones for the Clippers. Overall, went 5 of 8 from the field in 23 minutes, had 13 points. It was a +9 for them in the work that he did off the bench. He was terrific for them, providing the energy and intensity as being a part of that 6-man rotation that includes Norman Powell, who you looked in the game as well, only had 5 points, but at the same time for him was a +5 as well. So for the Mavericks, it's going to be about what can you get from your bench in terms of guys like Dereck Lively, maybe a little bit more of Josh Green. We'll see what Tim Hardaway and Maxi Kleber are able to provide from a scoring standpoint, because you've got to get more production from your bench. You look at the bench output for the game, while the Clippers only had 20, it felt like much more given the energy and the effort, particularly from Russell Westbrook, that you got. Mavericks only had 19 points from their bench in game number 1. That has to improve as well for the Mavericks going into game number 2. There's a lot of things from a coaching standpoint. I thought at times Jason Kidd looked out-coached by Ty Lue, by his Clippers team that looked much more prepared to be without their superstar than the Mavericks did to be prepared with the 2 superstars that they had. But this is going to be about Jason Kidd and his group setting the tone from the outset of this game to be much more physical, to be able to bring a presence and an energy and a focus that I thought you saw much better in the second half based on the way that they were able to get after the Clippers. And even defensively in that second quarter, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, holding the Clippers to just 22 points. But when you score 8, it doesn't really matter all that much. So there's a lot of things that the Mavericks can work on and improve upon based on what they didn't do in game number 1 that has to simply be better in game number 2. And for Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, yes, they combined for 64 points, but focusing much more on Luka in this case, he's going to shoulder a lot of the offensive load for sure, but he's got to find a way to be much better on the defensive end and participate more to provide some measure of resistance. There's only so much help that Daniel Gafford and Dereck Lively II and others can provide for Luka Doncic when it comes to trying to erase some of the things that may be allowed by his inability to keep guys in front of him. But to allow James Harden to get to his left as easily as he did, and more importantly, the Mavericks not dealing with the switching that allow Luka Doncic to continuously be hunted and then found and then be exploited on the perimeter is inexcusable given what the Mavericks know about how the Clippers are able to utilize James Harden from a facilitation and a scoring standpoint. And even when they had opportunities, Luka Doncic was able to take advantage of his opportunities on the offensive end by getting some switches with Zubac, which we know he gets him into barbecue chicken every time that happens when he gets him out there. So at times they were able to find that much more in the second half. But this is about the defensive effort that has got to be there going into game number 2, and the examples that we showed you a little bit earlier about how porous the Mavericks defense was and allowing the Clippers to get to the bucket at will and to really dominate inside the paint, especially early on in the game with Ivica Zubac. And we know that the Mavericks during the second half of the year, they were a plus rebounding team. They were out-rebounded in this game by the Clippers, and Ivica Zubac was really able to make his presence known on the inside. Gafford and Lively have got to be able to neutralize that going into game number 2. The Mavericks will have to ensure that they're knocking down shots from the outside and not allowing the Clippers to get out on these long runs that they had in game number 1. I expect a much better version of the Dallas Mavericks in game number 2, given the fact that they simply just didn't make enough shots to keep themselves competitive in game 1. That should be much better in game 2, and I expect Luca and Kyrie, particularly Luka Doncic, to be much more fervent in the pressure that he puts on the Clippers defense from an offensive standpoint. The question will be, will he answer the call on the defensive end and show some physicality and presence and be able to deal with some of the things that the Clippers are going to present for them? If you're the Clippers, it's more of the same. You established yourself on the inside with Zubac and his ability to be able to finish around the rim. He played much better on the perimeter, was able to move his feet and not at least be a liability for the Clippers when dealing with perimeter players. But for the Mavericks, much like how the Clippers, others were able to set the tone in game at number 1, the others for the Mavericks have got to respond in kind in game 2 to have their role players play much better in this second game to give them some confidence that as they go back to the American Airlines Center, they can be able to put together more and more consistent quarters based on what they were able to do in the second half. Because you look at the second half numbers, Mavericks were able to score 67 points when you look at the 34 that they had in the third quarter and the 33 that they scored in the fourth quarter. They were just down by so many that it really didn't matter based on them trying to make their comeback. But if you're Jason Kidd in this Mavericks coaching staff, you don't worry about what happened in the first half based on the amount of shots that you missed. You concern yourself about what you did well in the second half and take that with you to begin the first portion of the game in game number 2, and then you take your chances from there. Because, again, game 2 is a must-win. I will say this clearly so that you and I both know that I said, you say, Kevin, you said it and you put it on the record. Yes, I put it on the record. The Mavericks must win game 2. You cannot go back to the American Airlines Center down 0-2, even with the prospects of the unknown when it comes to Kawhi Leonard and when he comes back in this series. Because the longer that the Clippers are able to win games and not have to worry about bringing Kawhi Leonard back, the worse off, obviously, it is for the Mavericks in this scenario. So the more that you can win, the more pressure you put on the Clippers to try and get Kawhi Leonard back on the floor. Maybe not necessarily at 100%, but the more the Clippers continue to win, the more they feel better about their chances to buy time, because they know, based off of what we've seen in these other first 2 matchups, that this is going to be a long series between the Clippers and the Mavericks. But it can only be long, or hopefully be longer, if the Mavericks find a way to get a win in game 2. Because if they don't and they get down 0-2 coming back to the American Airlines Center on Friday, there is a lot of pressure on the Mavericks and some of these guys who have not been in this postseason situation or have a little bit of experience that haven't had enough in pressure situations to be able to hopefully respond in games 3 and 4. So, yes, game 2 is a must-win for the Mavericks to be able to even up the series at 1 game apiece, because the simple unknown of Kawhi Leonard having an opportunity to play or not in this series remains out there. And if you're the Mavericks, look, yes, you continue to prepare as if Kawhi Leonard is going to play at some point during this series, but you cannot allow that to get into your head because, again, I thought it was extremely disappointing knowing that the Kawhi Leonard that was not going to be on the floor, the Mavericks should have been able to take advantage of that, and they simply didn't do it. They have got to be much more mentally tough when it comes to game number 2 to give themselves the best shot, the best opportunity, put their best foot forward early on in this game to alleviate whatever concerns that they have from game number 1 and to ensure that they don't carry any of that over into game number 2, because if they don't, they're going to be in trouble, and in a lot of trouble at that, because this Clippers team is too good with too many veterans and have too much experience in these situations, no matter how much success or lack thereof they've had consistently in the postseason, to think that they're going to be the ones that fold based off of what they showed in game number 1, but also with the guys in Paul George. And yes, I know James Harden can't necessarily be counted upon at times, but you saw even just a year ago when he was with the Philadelphia 76ers, at times was able to put the Sixers on his back when Joel Embiid was missing games in that series to have some really terrific playoff performances, and he showed that he could still do that in game number 1 against the Mavericks. You've got to prepare for the best version of Paul George, James Harden, and others in this series to combat what you saw, and hopefully getting out of Los Angeles with a split, because it is a must for them to do so. Otherwise, this series will have a completely different tone going back to the AAC on Friday. But this is the sense of urgency that the Mavericks didn't play with in the first half against the Clippers. That cannot happen in game 2 and then find themselves trying to stay within this ball game, because we know that the Clippers are as good as anybody offensively. And when they are motivated, just like they were in game 1, to defend at a high level, at which they did, yes, the Mavericks did them a lot of favors by missing a ton of shots in the first half. In particular, this team, the Clippers, is as dangerous as any in the NBA. Don't forget, as hot as the Mavericks were going on the 24-7 run that they did, the Clippers had a similar run earlier on in the year where they went 26-5 in a 31-game stretch. They know how to turn it on and know how to play at an extremely high level. And when they decided to do so in game number 1, the Mavericks simply couldn't respond in kind in that first half, and it was over from there as they were down by 26 at halftime and really couldn't make a dent into the lead. Yes, they were able to get it down to about 12, 14 points in the fourth quarter, but it was simply too little, too late by then, based on the way that the first 3.5 quarters had went for the Mavericks against the Los Angeles Clippers. So a lot for the Mavericks to improve upon: shot making, defending Luka Doncic, and more importantly, more confidence hopefully built off the second half of what they did against the Clippers to give them a chance, the best chance, to walk out of Los Angeles with a win on Tuesday night. Game number 2 between the Mavericks and the Clippers will take place on Tuesday night at 9 p.m. at Crypto.com Arena, as the Mavericks look to even up their series at 1 game apiece in their best-of-7 series with the Clippers of Los Angeles. That'll do it for this episode of Inside the Mavs. Again, appreciate you joining me here for another episode of Inside the Mavs. Make sure you download and subscribe to Inside the Mavs, the official Mavericks podcast of 97.1 The Freak, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Give it a 5-star rating and write a review for it while you're there. And if you're watching this on my YouTube channel, make sure you subscribe, like, and comment to Kevin Gray Sports here on YouTube. Let me know how you're feeling about the Dallas Mavericks after game number 1 and what adjustments you want to see. Throw them in the comments and let me know what adjustments you want to see going into game number 2 for the Mavericks as they take on the Los Angeles Clippers. And remember, you can listen to me and Chuck Cooperstein as part of our Mavericks radio broadcast. We'll be broadcasting every single game, and I'll have my post-game recaps immediately following each and every game of the series, and podcast episodes throughout the week with Grant Afseth of Mavs Sports Illustrated. Again, thank you so much for joining me here on this episode of Inside the Mavs, the official Mavericks podcast of 97.1 The Freak, presented by Aura. My name is Kevin Gray, Mavericks pre- and post-game host on 97.1 The Freak on the Dallas Mavericks radio network. We'll talk to you later. Peace.